right, so we're going to talk about a couple of things. I'll try to do it very quickly. So we've seen JavaScript modules. So using npm init creates a little kind of folder, and then you can install things, third-party modules, and it all gets saved in a node modules folder. So it gets saved on this local directory, and you can use stuff within a project. So you kind of have this local environment with all of the third-party modules that you need. You do something similar with Python, since it works slightly differently. You create something called a virtual environment, and we'll talk about this again. I just want to introduce the idea, and you should use it if
Are you
you're.
meant to be screen
Yeah, I will in one second.
Oh, I got you. My bad.
Yeah, no, thank you though. So that should be visible. Okay, so we'll create what's called a virtual environment. And there are a couple ways of doing that in Python. But the simplest one, I think, is there's a virtual environment module in Python. It's built in. So the command you run is python-m. So this is to run a module on the command line. Then, so we're going to run the virtual environment module for Python, and we need to pass it a name, the name of our virtual environment. So I'll just call it my ven. And it's going to take a couple of seconds, but you can see it just like npm init, right? It does some work for us here. And now I have this folder, and it's got a bunch of junk in here, which we don't really need to worry about too much. But it's basically, it's going to kind of hijack my system. So when I install stuff in Python, it's not going to install globally on my system. It's just going to install locally here. And then when I access it, it's going to look here first before it goes to my entire system. So now that I have a local environment, I have to activate it. So I have it, everything's set up, but I have to activate it. So run source, the name of the environment, bind activate. So once you do that, now you're actually using your virtual environment, and you should see something similar to this change in your on your command line. So now I'm using my venv. Okay, so I'm using my venv, but so now I'm ready to start downloading stuff. So I'm gonna do a new share. Stop to. All right, so we saw that npmjs.org was the central official repository for npm stuff. For Python, it's pypi.org, pypi.org, and here something similar. So people who publish their third-party modules can put that stuff here. So we can do a search for whatever we want. Look for an emoji thing. So this tells us how to do it. So up here in the top left, this gives us, the name of the module or the library, the version, and how to install it. So pip, just like npm install whatever, it's pip install whatever. So let's go ahead and install that. Pip install emoji. Okay, small package. So it's installed now, and we can use it. So we'll create a file, import. And we'll try to run it. And now we can use emojis on our console. So this is not built into Python. Emoji is not built into Python. I didn't write this in another file. I downloaded this. Someone else put it up to be available to everyone on pypi.org. I created a virtual environment. So now whatever I'm doing, all the packages I'm downloading are isolated to this particular directory, and now I'm importing it just like I import anything from another file that I have locally or the Python standard library. I'm importing it, and then I can use it. I looked at the README and I can figure out how to use it. So that's using third-party libraries in Python. And we'll talk about this again using virtual environments. It's going to be something you do repeatedly. All right, so one last thing I want to go over is debugging. So we've seen debugging here in the browser. So let's do right. So if I go ahead and run this and I'll save it and I'll run the debugger, choose Python file. Okay, try that again. Oh, maybe I should start higher up. Okay, so I'll step through and I can take a look. All right, let me call a function.
Do you need to be in a directory? Because
Yeah.
it's not showing you in it on the bottom on the debug console.
So the debug console will change where it kind of creates its own environment there. Let me try commenting this out. Okay, maybe just didn't like that third-party import for some reason. But here I can go, just one thing we've mentioned before, but we can go into the debug console and we can just kind of check things out. So we can see what variables are. So x is 0, y is high. We can run methods. So x plus 200. So we can go in here, like as our code is executing, and we can do things. So we can test things out. We can kind of see what's going on in our code as it's executing. So that can be useful. There's also some ways to do that through the command line. And there's a question of why you would ever want to do that, but I'll show you a potential use case. So I'm using Docker right now. So I'm actually inside a Docker container. So you can think of this as basically like I'm SSHing into a remote server. Essentially this is like a remote server. I can do ls, and I have copied a Python file. So this is a server. It doesn't have VS Code. It doesn't have anything nice on it. It's just bare bones Linux stuff. So I can run Python, and has Python installed. Singleton.py. So that's something that we just saw earlier. It doesn't matter, but it runs Python code, right? So let's imagine that you have a bunch of code, Python code, running on a server remotely somewhere, and there's a bug, and you need to make some changes. You need to figure out what's going on. So it's possible that you might need to do remote debugging. And if you do remote debugging on something that doesn't have even like a GUI, much less VS Code or anything, you may need to be able to use a command line debugger. So what we can do is, I'm not going to create a virtual environment because this is a disposable thing. So pip install, and we're going to install. There are a couple debuggers built in, but this is maybe the one of the better ones. So IPDB. So this is going to run now, and I want to run Python IPDB, and then what was that file? Is it just IPDB? What was the? Well, let me look it up. So IPDB. We'll go to the thing. Okay, Python, IPython enabled IPDB. Import IPDB. So there was the problem. Use as the command line. Let's see. So here's what I need to do. I need to run it with -m as a module. Okay, so Python -m IPDB, and we will run the singleton. So this now gives us, we're kind of in an interactive debugger. So you can see this is the top of the file, line 1, line 2, line 3. This is a configurable setting. By default, it just shows us three lines for context. And we can step through just like we did with the Visual Code GUI debugger. You press the down arrow. Here, instead of down arrow, you press S, which means step. So S, step. So we're not doing anything terribly interesting. We're just calling, creating new instances or trying to. And here we get some information. It's telling us what the return value is. And that's what's being printed to the screen. You can create checkpoints. This might not be the best file for illustrating this, but you can create, you can press W, and that will tell you where you are in the file, in the execution of the file. You can do, let me see what some of the variables were. C, we'll see what C is. So C also will go all the way to the end of the program, but if I had named the variable something other than C, I would be able to see C, just like I could do in the Debug Console in VS Code. So you can play around with variables. You can look up the commands, but they're just usually single letter commands to move around. You can create breakpoints. You can do all that other stuff. So this is something that may be useful for you in your code. You can also kind of set breakpoints manually if you import IPDB and run it in a file itself. And so I will quit out of that and I'll exit. Now I'm back on my computer and that's it. So just a brief introduction to using a command line debugger.